v. pages 421–2. Chapter 2: A new theory of law. A refusal to subordinate the material of political facts to religious and moral principles, a refusal to subordinate it to the abstract concepts of the theory of natural law, which are nothing but disguised value judgments. That is what clears away the prejudices and opens the royal road of science. That is what introduces Montesquieu's great theoretical revolutions. The most famous of these is contained in 2 lines defining laws. Laws are the necessary relations arising from the nature of things. S.L.I. The theologian of the defense, who is not so naive as Montesquieu would have us think, cannot believe his eyes. The law's relations, what can he mean by this? The author has not, however, deviated from the ordinary definition of laws without design. 1. He was right. Montesquieu's intention, whatever he may have said, was certainly to change something in the received definition. The long history of the concept of law is well known. Its modern meaning, the sense of scientific law, only emerged in the works of the physicists and philosophers of the 16th and 17th centuries. And even then it still carried with it the traits of its past. Before taking the new sense of a constant relation between phenomenal variables, i.e. before relating to the practice of the modern experimental sciences, law belonged to the world of religion, morality and politics. It was, in its meaning, steeped in exigencies arising from human relations. Law thus presupposed human beings, or beings in the image of man, even if they surpassed it. The law was a commandment. It thus needed a will to I. A defense of the SL, Part 1, I, Objection I. 32. Order and wills to obey. A legislator and subjects. The law possessed thereby the structure of conscious human action. It had an end, it designated a target, at the same time as it required its attainment. For the subjects who lived within the law it offered the ambiguity of constraint and ideal. It is this meaning and its resonances that can be seen exclusively to dominate medieval thought, from St. Augustine to St. Thomas. Law having only one structure, divine law, natural laws and positive, human, laws could be discussed in the same sense. Every case exhibited the same form of commandment and end. Divine law dominated all laws. God had given his orders to nature as a whole and to man, and by doing so had fixed their ends. The other laws were no more than the echo of this primordial commandment, repeated more and more faintly throughout the universe, the communion of angels, human societies, nature. As we know, it is a fault of those who give orders, at least in certain institutions, to like them to be repeated. It was a long time before the idea that nature might have laws which were not orders could rid itself of this heritage. It is visible in Descartes, who still tried to reduce to a divine decree the laws he had discovered only in bodies, conservation of motion, fall, collision. With Spinoza came the awareness of a first difference, but the application of the word law to natural things seems to be metaphorical, for the ordinary meaning of law is simply a command. 2. In the 17th century, this long effort succeeded in disengaging a special domain for this new meaning of law, the domain of nature, of physics. Sheltered by the divine decree which still protected from on high the old form of law, saving the appearances, a new form of law was developing which, little by little, through Descartes and Newton, took the form stated by Montesquieu, a fixed and invariable relation between variable terms, such that each diversity is uniformity, each change is constancy, SLI. But it was hard to see how what is valid for falling or colliding bodies, and for the planets too. Theologico-Political Treatise, 4, in Benedict de Spinoza, The Political Works, edited and translated by A. G. Wernham, p. 69. Montesquieu, Politics and History J. J. moving in their orbits, could be turned into a universal model. The old sense of law, which is an order and an end pronounced by a master, maintained its original position, the domain of divine law, the domain of moral, or natural, law, the domain of human laws. And one can even note something at first sight paradoxical but rational enough, that the theoreticians of natural law whom I have discussed made their concepts a contribution to the old definition of law. Doubtless they, too, had secularized natural law, the God who pronounced it or, having made his decision, mounted guard over it, being as useless as Descartes' God, no more than a night watchman against thieves. But they had retained from the old version its teleological structure, its character as an ideal masked by the immediate appearances of nature. For them natural law was as much a norm, devoir, as a necessity. All their demands found refuge and support in a definition of law which was still foreign to the new one. But in these two lines, Montesquieu proposes quite simply to expel the old version of the word law from the domains which it still held, and to consecrate the reign of the modern definition, law as a relation, over the whole extent of beings, from God to stones. In this sense, all beings have their laws, the deity his laws, the material world its laws, the intelligences superior to man their laws, the beasts their laws, man his laws, SLI. Everything is in this sentence. At last an end has been put to all forbidden reserves. The scandal can well be imagined. No doubt God is still there to give the initial push, if not to mislead. He created the world. But he is no more than one of the terms of the relations. He is the primitive reason, but the laws put him on the same footing as beings. Laws are the relations subsisting between it, primitive reason, i.e. God, and different beings, and the relations of these to one another, SLI. Add to this the fact that God himself, the institutor of these laws, in creating beings sees his own primordial decree subordinated to a necessity of the same nature, and even God falls inwardly victim to the universal contagion of the law. If he did make these laws that govern the world, the ultimate reason is that they are relative to three for his wisdom and power. Once God has been dealt with, the rest follows. The best way to reduce one's opponent is to bring him over to one's own side. He watched over the old domains. They have now been opened up to Montesquieu, and first of all the entire world of the existence of men in their cities and in their history. He is at last to be able to impose on them his own law. We must face up to the implications of this theoretical revolution. It presupposes that it is possible to apply a Newtonian category of law to matters of politics and history. It presupposes that it is possible to draw from human institutions themselves the wherewithal to think their diversity in a uniformity and their changes in a constancy, the law of their diversification and the law of their development. This law will no longer be an ideal order but instead a relation immanent to the phenomena. 3. It will not be given in the intuition of essences, but drawn from the facts themselves, without preconceived ideas, by investigation and comparison, by trial and error. At the moment of its discovery, it will be no more than a hypothesis, and will only become a principle once it has been verified by the utmost diversity of phenomena. Have followed my objects without any fixed plan, I have known neither rules nor exceptions, I have found the truth only to lose it again. But, when I had once discovered my first principles, everything I fought for appeared. S.L. Preface. Have laid down the first principles, and have found that the particular cases apply naturally to them, that the histories of all nations are only consequences of them. Ibid. This is indeed the cycle of an empirical science in search of the law of its object, almost to the point of direct experimentation. But this theoretical revolution also presupposes that the object of scientific observation, here the civil and political laws of human societies, is not confused with the results of the investiga. 3. A clear Newtonian resonance in Montesquieu's formulations. The author, he says of himself, is not treating of causes, nor does he compare causes, but he treats of effects, and compares effects. A defense of the S.L., Part 1, 1, the answer to objection in cf. Also the following note on polygamy: it is not an affair of calculation, when we reason on its nature; it may be an affair of calculation, when we combine its effects. Ibid, Part 11, of Polygamy. Montesquieu, Politics and History 35 shun itself, that there is no play on the word lamb. This dangerous confusion is inherent in the fact that Montesquieu, who with all objects of knowledge disengages their lambs from the facts, is here seeking to know a particular object, the positive lambs of human societies. But the laws found in Greece in the 5th century BC or in the kingdom of the first Frankish line, are obviously not laws in the first sense, scientific laws. They are juridical institutions, for which Montesquieu wants to state the scientific law of their distribution and evolution. He says this quite plainly when he distinguishes between lambs and their spirit. They do not pretend to treat of laws, but of their spirit, and this spirit consists in the various relations which the laws may have to different objects. SL 1, 3. Thus Montesquieu does not confuse the laws of his object, the spirit of laws, with his object itself, lambs. I believe that this simple distinction is indispensable if a certain misunderstanding is to be avoided. Still in Book I, having shown that all the beings of the universe and even God are subject to laws as relations, Montesquieu envisages the differences in their modalities. In this way, he distinguishes between the laws that govern inanimate matter, and which brook not the slightest deviation, and the laws that govern beasts and men. As one rises in the scale of being, laws lose their fixity and at any rate their observation its precision. The intelligent world is far from being so well governed as the physical. Thus man, who has over other beings the privilege of knowledge, is prone to error and the passions. Hence his disobedience, As an intelligent being, he incessantly transgresses the laws established by God, and changes those of his own institution, sli. Worse still, he does not even observe those he has given himself. But it is precisely this errant being, in its history, that is the object of Montesquieu's investigations, a being whose conduct does not always obey the laws it is given, and in addition can have special laws it has made, positive laws, without for all that respecting them any more than the others. These reflections may seem in Montesquieu's case those of a moralist deploring man's weakness. I believe rather that they are those of a theoretician who is here confronting a profound ambiguity. Indeed, two different interpretations can be given of this distinction between the modalities of laws, two interpretations which represent two tendencies in Montesquieu himself. In the first, one could say, sticking firmly to the methodological principle that the laws of relation and variation that can be disengaged from human laws are distinct from those laws themselves, men's errors and deviations with respect to those laws raise no problems. The sociologist, unlike the physicist, is not dealing with an object, a body, which is obedient to a simple determinism and follows a line from which it does not deviate, but with a very special type of object, men who deviate even from the laws they give themselves. What then has to be said about men and their relation to their laws? That they change them, get round them or violate them. But none of this affects the idea that it is possible to disengage from their obedient or rebellious conduct a law that they follow without knowing it, and from their very errors, the truth of this law. To be discouraged in the search for the laws of men's conduct one must be so simple as to take the laws they give themselves for the necessity governing them. In truth, their error, the aberrations of their humor, their violation and changing of their laws, are quite simply part of their conduct. All that is required is to disengage the laws of the violation of laws, or of their changing. And this is indeed what Montesquieu does in almost every chapter of The Spirit of Laws. Open a book on history, the Roman succession, justice in the early period of feudalism, etc., it is clear that its object consists precisely of human divagation and variation. This attitude already presupposes a very fruitful methodological principle, the refusal to take the motives of human action for its dynamic, the ends and arguments men consciously propose to themselves for the real, most often unconscious causes which make them act. Montesquieu thus appeals constantly to causes of which men are ignorant: climate, soil, manners and morals, the inner logic of a set of institutions, etc., precisely so as to explain human laws and the deviation which separates men's conduct both from primitive Montesquieu, Politics and History 37 laws, the natural laws of morality, and from positive laws. Everything goes to show that Montesquieu did not intend to state the spirit of laws, i.e. the law of laws, without also stating the bad human side of the spirit of laws, the law of their violation, in one and the same principle. This interpretation allows us to give a perhaps more apt sense to a theme which constantly recurs in Montesquieu, and which seems to concern the norms, devoirs, governing laws. Indeed, when discussing human laws, we very often find Montesquieu appealing from existing laws to better ones. A strange paradox for a man who refuses to judge what is by what ought to be, doit and yet falls into the trap that he himself has denounced. Montesquieu says, for example, and this clashes with all the laws deprived of that reason he describes in his book, that law in general is human reason, inasmuch as it governs all the peoples of the earth. He also says that laws ought to be adapted to the people, that they ought to be relative to the nature and principle of the government, that they ought to be relative to the physical constitution of the country, etc. The list of these oughts or norms is endless. And just when one thinks one has properly grasped the essence of his definition of the nature and principle of a government, one is astonished to read that this does not imply that, in a particular republic, they actually are, but that they ought to be, virtuous. Otherwise the government is imperfect, SL, 2. Despotism itself, to be perfect, God knows by what sort of perfection, has itself some norms to respect. The general conclusion from these texts seems to be, the theoretician of the ideal, or the legislator, has taken the place of the scientist. The latter only wanted facts, the former proposes ends. But here again the misunderstanding depends in part on a wordplay on the two laws, the laws really ordering the actions of men, the laws the scientist is investigating, and the laws ordained by men. When Montesquieu proposes norms for the laws, this is only for the laws that men provide themselves. These norms are quite simply a demand for men to narrow the distance between the laws that govern men unbeknownst to them and the laws they make and know. It is indeed an appeal to the legislator, but an appeal for him, aware of the illusions of ordinary consciousness and critical of that blind consciousness, to model himself on the enlightened consciousness of the scientist, i.e. on science, and to make the conscious laws he gives men conform as far as possible to the unconscious laws that govern them. Hence it is not a question of an abstract ideal, of an infinite task which concerns men because they are impotent and errant beings. It is a question of a correction of errant consciousness by well-founded science, of the unconscious consciousness by the scientific consciousness. Hence it is a question of transferring the acquisitions of science into political practice itself, correcting the errors and unconsciousness of that practice. Such is the first of the two possible interpretations, and it illuminates the immense majority of Montesquieu's examples. Thus understood, Montesquieu is indeed the conscious precursor of all modern political science, which will have none of any but a critical science, which only disengages the real laws of the conduct of men from the apparent laws they provide for themselves in order to criticize those apparent laws and modify them, thus returning to history the results obtained in the knowledge of history. This scientific distance with respect to history and this conscious return to history can, of course, if the object of the science is taken for the science itself, provide a pretext for the accusation of political idealism, cf. Poincaré, science is in the indicative, action in the imperative. But once it is clear that the distance described as ideal between the existing state and the project of its reform is in this case simply the distance of a science from its object and from ordinary consciousness, every objection of this kind falls. In the apparent ideal that science proposes for its object, it is merely restoring to it what it had taken from it, its own distance, which is knowledge itself. But I have to admit that there is another possible interpretation of the texts I have been discussing, and one that can be sustained in Montesquieu himself. Here indeed is the way he introduces human laws into the concert of general laws, particular intelligent 38 Montesquieu, politics and history 3 grams beings may have laws of their own making, but they have some likewise which they never made. Before there were intelligent beings, they were possible, they had therefore possible relations, and consequently possible laws. Before laws were made, there were relations of possible justice. To say that there is nothing just or unjust, but what is commanded or forbidden by positive laws, is the same as saying that, before the describing of a circle, all the radii were not equal. We must therefore acknowledge relations of justice antecedent to the positive law by which they are established. And these primitive laws are related to God. These laws of an always pre-existent justice, independent of all the concrete conditions of history, amount to the old type of commandment law, normative law. It matters little whether they are called divine and are exercised by the ministrations of natural religion, or moral and are exercised by the education of fathers and teachers or by the voice of nature which Montesquieu, before Rousseau, called the sweetest of all sounds, or political. It is no longer a question of the positive human laws engaged in concrete conditions of existence from which the scientist has to disengage precisely their law. It is a question of a norm established for man by nature or God, which amounts to the same thing. And this characteristic contains, of course, a confusion of orders. Scientific law disappears behind commandment law. This temptation can be detected very distinctly at the end of the first chapter of Book 1. The quotations I have used to support the first interpretation then tend in a completely new direction. It is just as if, now, human error, that integral part of men's conduct, was no longer an object of the science, but the profound argument justifying the existence of laws, i.e. of norms. It would be amusing to imagine that the reason why bodies do not have positive laws is because they do not have the wit to disobey their laws. For the reason men do have such laws is less because of their imperfection, who would not give all the stones in the world for a man, than because of their capacity for insubordination. Man, he is left to his private direction, though a limited being, and subject, like all finite intelligences, to 4 degrees ignorance and error. Even his imperfect knowledge he loseth, and, as a sensible creature, he is hurried away by 1,000 impetuous passions. Such a being might every instant forget his Creator. God has therefore reminded him of his duty by the laws of religion. Such a being is liable every moment to forget himself. Philosophy has provided against this by the laws of morality. Formed to live in society, he might forget his fellow creatures. Legislators have, therefore, by political and civil laws, confined him to his duty. This time we have really fallen back, no question. These laws are orders. They are laws against forgetfulness, laws of recall which restore to man his memory, i.e. his duty or norms, range him with the end he has to pursue, whether he will or no, if he wants to fulfill his destiny as a man. These laws no longer concern the relation between man and his conditions of existence, but rather human nature. The normative margin in these laws no longer, as above, concerns the distance between the human unconsciousness and the consciousness of its laws, it concerns the human condition. Human nature, human condition, here we are right back in a world we thought we had broken with. In a world of values fixed in heaven in order to draw to them the gaze of men. Here Montesquieu returns like a good boy to the most insipid of traditions. Eternal values do exist. Read the statement of this in Book I. The laws must be obeyed, one's benefactor must be recognized, one's creator must be obeyed, evil deeds will be punished. A remarkable list. A second one complements it, Book I, Chapter 2, teaching that nature gives us the idea of a creator and inclines us towards him, that it intends that we should live in peace, that we should eat, that we should be inclined towards the other sex, and be desirous of living in society. The rest is added bit by bit, scattered as it is in more remote passages, that a father owes his offspring nourishment, but not necessarily inheritance, that a son supports his father if he is in trouble, that women must give way to men in the home, and above all that behavior relating to modesty is all important in human purposes, whether it is a question of women in most of their actions, in Montesquieu, Politics and History 41 marriage combinations, or the conjugation of the two sexes in abominable encounters, that despotism and torture conflict with human nature always, and slavery often. In short, a number of liberal demands, some more political ones, and many platitudes in support of well-established customs. Nothing remotely resembling the generous attitudes that other no less brutish, but more resolute or naive theorists attributed or were to attribute to human nature, liberty, equality, fraternity. We really are in another world. I believe that this side of Montesquieu is not a matter of indifference. It does not amount only to one isolated concession in a set of rigorous exigencies, the tribute paid to satisfy the world's prejudices, in order to have peace. Montesquieu needed this recourse and refuge, as he needed the ambiguity of his conception of law to combat his most ferocious opponents. Reread his reply to the watchful theologian. These laws which precede themselves, these equal radii equal for all eternity, before anyone, God or man, had ever drawn a circle anywhere, these relations of equity predating all possible positive laws, provide him with an argument against the Hobbesian threat. The author was attempting to overthrow Hobbes's system, a system the most terrible, in that by making all the virtues and vices depend on the establishment of laws men make for themselves. He, like Spinoza, overthrows both all religion and all morality. For so much for religion and morality. But something quite different is at stake. No longer the laws controlling religion and morality, but the laws governing politics, decisive laws for Montesquieu himself. It is the foundation of these laws that is at stake for Hobbes in the contract. These eternal laws of Montesquieu's, laws pre-existing all human laws, are thus really the refuge in which he protects himself from his opponent. That there were laws before laws makes it clear that there is no longer a contract, nor any of the political perils to which the very idea of a contract commits men and governments. In the shelter of the eternal laws of a nature without egalitarian structure, one can fight the opponent from afar. He can be awaited on the fore. A Defense of FDSL, Part 1,1, the answer to Objection I. 42 Terrain of nature, a terrain, however, that one has chosen before him, and with the appropriate weapons. Everything is prepared for the defense of a different cause from nature's, that of a shaken world one would like to re-establish on its foundations. It is certainly not the least of Montesquieu's paradoxes that he thus served old causes with ideas the strongest of which were completely new. But it is time to follow him into his most familiar thoughts, which are also his most secret ones. Chapter